All right. Hi, my name's Joel CORRY. I'll give you a little bit of my background. I was an agent for over 15 years, primarily representing football players. I went to Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, played basketball there. Went to law school at UCLA. How I got in the industry was I took a sports law class my second year of law school. I had a project which was negotiating the contract of a fictitious Dodgers baseball player that was a cross between Steve Sachs and Jose Offerman. The Dodgers general counsel, those are names you know that are that are from the past, but the negotiator on the other side was the Dodgers general counsel, Sam Fernandez. My professor's wife had a colleague from when she was at a law firm that was looking for summer help at a sports agency. My professor recommended me for the position. I was told when I took the position that it had no prospect for becoming anything more than a summer position. Me being a stupid 24-year-old decided, well, we'll see. By the middle of the summer, I'll change their mind. I actually did change their mind. That turned into a part-time position during my last year of law school and a full-time position when I got out of school. When I got out of school, the owner of the agency signed Shaquille O'Neal as a client. The other clients, the marquee clients at the time, were Hakeem Olajuwon and Ronnie Lott. Having Shaquille as a client of the agency gave me a chance to work on a lot of things I never would have otherwise at a high level, and I gained a lot of experience that would have taken me years to develop without having Shaquille as a client. I focused on basketball initially, but Leonard Armato, my boss, really wanted to maximize Shaquille instead of doing what David Falk did, which is use Michael Jordan as a magnet for other clients. I was splitting time between basketball and football, gravitated towards football because I was able to start recruiting football players more and help develop a football practice. Some of the clients from the football practice were John Randall, Keenan McCardell, Jimmy Smith, Willie McGinnis. We had a very amicable split, which doesn't happen much in the sports agency industry, where we were able to take the football clients, form our own company, and still share office space with Leonard. And I consulted for Leonard for about 4 or 5 years after that on basketball matters and Shaquille contracts. I got out of the industry about 5, 6 years ago, and now I do some litigation consulting for sports lawsuits, and I write on salary cap and contract matters for National Football Post and CBSSports.com. So that's really my background. And I teach the athlete management class, and it's good to meet several of you that I've gotten to know through the chat and put name and face together. I already knew Alyssa from the Indianapolis conference, and also she took my NFLPA agent exam prep course, which was new this year. And Raul was in that class, so it was good to meet him, and it's good to see all you guys that have taken the athlete management class so I can put name and face together with you guys. Now, what I want to go over today is some aspects of recruiting, and particularly pertaining to recruiting NFL or football clients, particularly NFL. Now, the first thing you have to know is that the NFL is a little bit different than other sports just because of the fact that you have an additional barrier to entry because NFLPA passed what I call the runner rule a couple of years ago, that unless you're a certified agent, you can't recruit clients, which kind of which makes it more challenging. That means if you're an agent advisor, then if there's someone you know, you have to turn the contact over to Dr. Lashbrook, and he's going to handle the recruiting aspect. If you become certified, then you can start recruiting. And if you want to become certified, I recommend that you take my NFLPA prep course because I like to think that it's going to help you make sure you pass the test and give you insight and knowledge that you wouldn't be able to gain just from trying to read the CBA if you don't have any background in the industry. There's one exception to this runner rule. I call it the Jay-Z rule. Because what the NFLPA decided was that you can have, if you're not certified, and you can have there can be a meeting at the office of the agent with non-certified people, one meeting, if that person's involved in the agency. So that's kind of pertained to Geno Smith's recruiting, and they kind of, in my opinion, look the other way and have kind of created what's called the Jay-Z rule. So if you're not certified, that's the only way you can be involved in recruiting. Besides the NFLPA regulations, there are NCAA rules you have to also adhere to. And the general basic rules are the two things. You can't agree to represent players orally in writing before their eligibility is up or they renounce it. And two, you can't give the players anything, player or his family, anything of value. Generally, those are NCAA rules. There's state regulations as well. If you're going to be an agent, that applies to any sport, where if you're going to recruit in California, you've got to register in their state. Registration for most states is generally anywhere between $200 and $500 per state. So that's going to factor into how wide of a net you cast in recruiting. And then there's also individual school restrictions. More and more you're seeing schools that villainize agents and want to keep them at arm's length or have control in the process, where a lot of times now you have to alert the athletic department or compliance officer that you're even talking to their student athletes. Some schools will try to set up restrictions where you can't talk to their student athletes except for a certain time frame, maybe at the beginning of the year, depending upon the school. And some schools like USC have started this absurd concept, which is basically speed dating, where they have an agent day, which they had a couple of weeks ago, and if you participate in it, you could meet with their athletes for a grand total of 10 minutes and give your pitch for 10 minutes, and then you can't talk to them for the end of the year. I don't know how effective that's going to be in a process for the players getting to know who's going to represent them, or them really being able to figure out who's the best person to represent them. But that's what USC is trying right now. A school like Texas with Charlie Strong, he doesn't want you talking to his players until the end of the season. He did that at Louisville, and that really puts the players at a disadvantage. I think what schools do this for is not for their own selfish reasons. I think they don't want anything to jeopardize eligibility for their players, and they figure if we can keep agents away, then by the end of the year, we'll have our whole team's eligibility intact, and then they can worry about their finding representation afterwards. But I always thought schools should always be mindful of the fact that they shouldn't put any type of restrictions on agents that they wouldn't want on their own recruiting high school athletes. But that seems to be a trend right now in terms of what happens. Now, where do you find clients? Now, recruiting is essentially sales, because you're selling yourself, you're selling what you can do and how you can benefit a particular athlete. And anyone who has a sales background may be at an advantage initially in terms of recruiting, because recruiting can also be a very expensive endeavor depending upon how wide of a net you're going to cast in recruiting, just because of the state regulations. So one thing I'd recommend for everyone is to think about, if you live in California, say Southern California, or you live in North Carolina, which has a lot of schools or athletes, to think first locally. Recruit in that area. Like when I lived in Southern California when I was an agent, so we would recruit Pac-10 schools, Pac-10 then, now Pac-12, USC, UCLA, also go up and recruit other Pac-12 schools, also Mountain West schools. So think locally, think regionally. And if you're in football, it's not quite as competitive as basketball, because in basketball there are 50 guys you would want to represent each year. In football, there are 300 legitimate prospects annually. So just because you're not recruiting the Johnny Manziels of the world doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to recruit a legitimate NFL prospect. And I would also be realistic initially when I'm recruiting. That first time out, you're not going to get the Johnny Manziels of the world, but you may be able to get a 6th, 7th round pick or a priority free agent that has a chance to play on an NFL team. And one way that I've found that you can initiate contact with players, and some agents that I still talk to today do this, is through social media. That they'll put in a Facebook request, and that'll be one way they can make an initial contact, or either through Twitter. Because unless you have some sort of actual relationship with someone, then you're going to be cold calling. And use what's at your disposal. If you have a friend or know someone that knows an athlete who is a viable prospect, use that contact to help you develop some sort of relationship in recruiting. Because one thing that some agents also do is, if there's a school that has like a football school in the area, they'll go to practice, spring practice, and try to make an introduction to them after the game, after practice. Schools kind of frown upon that. Some will close their spring practices, but that's one thing for you to consider, is a way to cultivate a relationship or get an introduction to an athlete. And one thing to keep in mind when you're recruiting generally is always try to network with people that you meet. And one area you're going to want to develop contacts with is scouts, particularly the area scouts, because they know more about the prospects early on than, we'll say, the general manager or people who are higher up in the organization. Part of that can also be an ulterior motive from them, because area scouts eventually move up, become college scouting director, pro scouting director, maybe even a general manager. But what you also see is that these people may think, well, if we turn an agent on to a particular player that's a priority free agent, maybe he'll remember that when it comes time for us to sign him. And also, area scouts, when they're moving up the organizational ladder, may need help going from one place to another. So these are good contacts to make. We got a client from an area scout several years ago. When Mason Crosby was considered the top kicking prospect, an area scout told me, everyone's on Mason Crosby, but you need to think about this kicker at Arizona, Nick Folk. And we didn't really follow kickers that much. And he's draftable. He's going to be a mid to late round pick. So we started cultivating a relationship with him and ended up signing him. And for a while there, he was considered the better kicker than Mason Crosby. Was franchised by the Jets this year. My old firm still represents him, and he ended up getting a contract for over $3 million a year. One thing to think about when you're recruiting is, what is a signable prospect? Because it's very easy for you to sign someone that nobody wants to represent. That's not the type. That's the type of player you really don't want to represent, because you're going to be spinning your wheels. One thing you got to think about as well is the character and integrity of the people you're recruiting. Because when you sign a client, that's a relationship where you're going to be dealing with them on a frequent basis and an intimate basis. And if you don't like the people you represent, that's going to become very, very challenging relationship on your part. One way for you to kind of get an idea of character is, and employers in all industries do this now, is you can kind of look at someone's Facebook page if it's open, or if you're a Facebook friend, see what they're posting, see what type of videos they have, see what type of status changes they have. And you can get an idea from, to a degree, with social media, whether that's someone you really want to represent. Because one thing we would do at USC was talk to some of our former clients and get a feel for what type of person the player we were thinking about was. And no matter how high of a prospect was, there were a couple of times with first-round picks that we had some of our former clients say, he's not your type of guy, that physically he's ready to play in the NFL, but mentally he's light years away. So that was the type of guy that we didn't want. And I'll give you a quick story. It's a basketball story. But when I first got started, I really was interested in Isaiah J.R. Ryder, who played at UNLV, played for the Timberwolves. We had started recruiting him. I'd met him at the Final Four. They had developed a good rapport with him there. And at the time, Shaq was about to start filming Blue Chips. My boss, Leonard Armato, had a good relationship with Billy Friedkin, so we had a little bit of sway in terms of the other main roles in the movie. And we'd set it up for Isaiah to read for the part that went to Penny Hardaway. I was supposed to pick him up at the airport. Nick Nolte was flying across country from New York specifically to read with Isaiah. I go to the airport. Everyone gets off the plane. He's not on the plane. So I call, I have to use a payphone. This is how long ago this is. No cell phones. Call him at his apartment. He's like, oh man, I went out last night. I couldn't make the plane. Can we just do this tomorrow? And I'm like, can you please get on the next plane? I explained to him Nick Nolte's coming in specifically for him. He's like, no man, can we do this tomorrow? I have to go back to the office and tell Leonard he doesn't get on the plane. And I'm real hot on JR or Isaiah because I thought he was going to be pretty marketable because he won the college dunk contest. He'd be perfect for Reebok's above the rim shoe line. Leonard tells me, you know what, we need to stop recruiting this guy. He's going to burn bridges that we already created, and he's going to do more harm than good, even though he's going to be a top 5 pick. I didn't understand that when I'm 25 years old. If you'd asked me 2 years later, I definitely would have gotten it. And every time Isaiah Ryder did something wrong, Leonard would come into my office and say, you see what Isaiah did? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, you know who'd be cleaning up that mess? And I'm like, me? He's like, yeah, you. So that's why it's very important for you to get an idea of the character and the integrity of the person you're representing, because ideally you don't want to have a lot of clients where you're cleaning up a ton of messes. And you even see some of the top agencies that don't really adhere to this practice. Athletes First, that represents a ton of NFL players, very prominent ones. One of the clients they represented, Aaron Hernandez. And he was like a walking billboard for them before he was arrested. He was always wearing Athletes First shirts, hats out. I'd have been like, Aaron, please do not wear this in public. Because that's something that a lot of agents don't really adhere to. They think, we'll take a client who has a lot of potential to make a lot of money for us, or it could be a Pro Bowl caliber player, and don't really think about the type of players they're representing. Because not only do the players you represent reflect on you, but they also reflect on your other clients as well. So that's something to think about. When you're looking at football players, you want guys to have good football measurables. Like, one thing you don't really want is an undersized corner nowadays. If you don't want the 5'9" corner, because from a draft standpoint, he's not going to be a guy that teams are going to have high on their list for the most part. There are guys like Brent Grimes who are undersized that have become Pro Bowl caliber players. I even represented one that was extremely undersized. Some of you may remember Mark McMillan from the Philadelphia Eagles. He's about 5'7". He's basically Spud Webb playing football. Only reason he could play, he ran a 4.2 840 and had a 40-inch vertical. But he was a 10th round pick. They're not even 10 rounds anymore. So that kind of tells you how he was valued. What you don't really want is the highly productive wide receiver that runs a 4.7 40. That's a guy that is going to have a harder time proving that he's an NFL caliber player than other players, because you want guys who have physical tools from a size, speed, and height ratio. There was a guy that we represented, Sammy Knight, that we didn't have out of the draft, out of USC, that was a tweener. He was a linebacker that was safety sized, but ran in the 4.8s, had great football instincts, was undrafted, started as a rookie with the Saints, became a Pro Bowl caliber player. But those are the types of guys that can sometimes get lost in the shuffle, and if they don't go to the right situation, then their NFL careers are going to be short, or they're not going to have one at all. One thing I would look for in terms of finding some potential guys that could be diamonds in the roughs or sleepers is looking at some former basketball players, because you're starting to see, particularly at the tight end position, where teams are looking at those guys like Antonio Gates, former basketball player, Jimmy Graham, or guys who've made position switches after they get to college. Like Richard Sherman, 5th round pick, was a wide receiver at Stanford initially, turned into a Pro Bowl corner. Or guys from FCS schools or Division II schools that are highly productive, like a Danny Woodhead. Or this year you saw a guy from an NAIA school, Pierre Deschier, out of Lindenwood, who was a 4th round pick. When it comes to recruiting, one of the main things you need to try to do is develop a comfort level with the player and also gain his trust. Sometimes it isn't the guy who has the best presentation, the most experience, or is the most knowledgeable. It's who the player feels most comfortable with. And here's an example of that. There was a basketball player this year's drafted, P.J. Harrison. He signed with an uncertified agent. And the reason he did that, it was he didn't know the guy was uncertified. I don't know how that happens. But he said, I signed with Juan Morrow because I was more comfortable with him than anyone else. So having the player be comfortable with you and gaining his trust, that's a very key part of recruiting. One thing you want to make sure you do is identify the people who are influential in the decision-making process. Because there have been times where we would recruited the player, and it's not the player who's making the decision. It's the family that's making the decision. When you do that, you're wasting your time, because you spent a bunch of time when you could have been talking to the person who's going to make the decision or recruiting another player. So you always want to try to identify. What I eventually ended up doing was asking, all right, who's important in the process? Do we need to talk to your parents as well? Or is this a decision you're going to make by yourself? So always know who the decision maker is. And one thing I started doing, which I didn't do initially, was I would ask players, what's important to you? So I get an idea of what they were looking for, because that also helps you determine whether it'd be a good fit for you as well. And the timing of the recruiting process is normally for a senior, you're going to start about a year out from the draft, if not a little bit earlier, because most agents are still focusing on trying to get their players who are still draft eligible. They're focusing on them, haven't quite turned their attention totally to recruiting. But ideally, you'll start initiating contact then. If it's underclassmen that you think could declare for the draft, then you're going to start that time with a guy who's going to be a junior. And he may not come out, so you would end up recruiting him for 2 years, but you would kind of err on the side of caution with a guy that you think could come out as an underclassman. Now that you have social media, the internet being very prominent today as opposed to 15 years ago, you might want to think about creating a website. Most agencies have some sort of website where you can get an idea of who the clients are and what type of services you provide. And when you're recruiting a person, I would kind of let the player kind of decide the frequency of contact, because these guys don't want to be bothered on a daily basis, maybe not a weekly basis. I'd touch base with guys like every couple of weeks during the off season. And you don't want to always talk about football business. You want to talk to them about their lives, get an idea of them as people. So it's not just you talking about here's football aspects of things and what I can do for you on a. You're bringing that up, but you don't want to make that your sole purpose, because you're not really going to get to know the person that way. And if you're trying to have them be comfortable with you, then you're going to have to talk about things outside of just the agency relationship. And you really want to try to set up a meeting with them before their senior year or their football season starts, assuming that the school hasn't put some sort of restrictions or is running a process where there's limited contact or no contact, because a lot of the screening happens where they're making their initial determinations on who gets to the next step, maybe before the season, whether it's a meeting with the player or with the family, because some players will decide, I may do the initial screening, talk to people with my family or my parents, and then I'm going to divorce myself from the process during the year. You talk to my parents during the year, so you would keep in contact with them, and then I'll kind of pick it up as the season winds down, or at the end, or at the end of the season. And some schools go through the whole career counseling panels. I always found that if the players are going to adhere through that process, sometimes the schools have some favorites where they're agents that have gotten players from that school in the past, and they'll kind of point players in that direction. We really think you should focus on these particular agents. Sometimes the whole career counseling panel can kind of be a sham where the player is just doing it to placate the school, and he kind of knows what he's doing. I've been in situations for that where we knew we were going to get a guy. He went through the panel, and the panel was more for show. So you also have to be aware of that with the whole career counseling panels. And one thing you really got to think about as well is what can you do which can distinguish you from the competition in terms of what can you offer that another player can't offer, another agent can't offer. But also in recruiting, there's certain guys, it doesn't matter how great your presentation is, if you have the great comfort level with them. Some guys are going to be persuaded by perks and superficial things that you really wouldn't think would be important in recruiting. And it's just the nature of the beast that some clients are going to go with someone that offers them the ability to go to some great party or backstage passes at a concert. Those may not be the types of guys that are for you, depending upon your philosophy. So that's one thing I found out, that clients, and it's like people who have similar philosophies kind of attract each other. That if you're someone who's an agent of integrity and you're someone who's doing everything by the book, which I would hope everyone does, even though that's not always the case in the agent business, that you'll get a sense for which guys aren't that way, and those be the types of guys that you really don't want as clients and you don't really want to try to recruit. Now, one big area or piece which didn't exist when I started, which I think is a sham, and I'm surprised that this industry has become so important, is combine training and preparation. That when I got started, combine preparation and training consisted of the player working with the strength coach at the school, maybe the track coach, and that was it. Now that combine training and preparation is a part of the whole recruiting process, it's a piece that the players really focus on more so than they should. And they'll look at the APIs, I think it's called now Exos, where training can cost up to $25,000 per client. That's something that you're going to have to compete with. What some of my friends who are agents have done is they'll work out a deal with someone who's trying to get into the whole training aspect, where it's kind of tiered, where I'll pay you a flat fee, significantly less than what you'd pay at one of these training facilities. And depending upon where the player goes, the guy will get a bonus. And I think this whole area is kind of a scam, because you can't take a slow guy, I don't care who you are in training, and turn him into Usain Bolt. That just doesn't happen. That a guy's he can learn better technique in his start with a 40, because nobody's ever running a 40 generally when you play football outside of the combine, to help him shave a little bit of time off of his time. But you're not going to turn someone that is slow into a fast guy. But that's an area of the business that is here to stay, unfortunately. I'd like to see that reverse, but that's a cost of doing business as well. And when you sign your first client, for some of the initial steps you should take are, one, getting a medical assessment of your client, because you never know what type of injury he has that he may not know about, or that he was trying to play through to help his team. Because I have a friend that represents Chris Polk, running back from the University of Washington, plays for Philadelphia now. He didn't know that Chris Polk had a torn labrum when he signed him, because the university didn't fully disclose the injury to him. And Chris Polk may have been anywhere from a 3rd to 5th round pick if he'd had a good shoulder, but NFL teams were leery of drafting him because of how serious the shoulder was, and he ended up being undrafted. He's in line to be the 2nd ball carrier in Philadelphia. I know Darren Sproles is there, but he's really more of a 3rd down back. So if something happens to LaShawn McCoy, Chris Polk will be the guy who would get the bulk of the carries. But you see guys who are college athletes that don't know or got injured during the season and have an injury that has to be dealt with. Because one of the things at the Combine that's one of the biggest aspects that's overlooked by the general public, because everybody's focusing on what the player's doing in his workout, but the medical check at the Combine, the physical that teams give the guys, is what's very important. Because if you have a guy that has some sort of major injury, then you're going to have to decide, do I get this addressed now, or is it something that I can work around so he'll be able to work out for a pro day? Because I have another, same friend represents Kiko Alonso. He had a knee issue when he was coming out. There was a minor issue where he could have gotten it fixed or try to through surgery, or kind of let him kind of heal it on his own. Kiko, fortunately, was able to get healthy before his pro day. There were limited things he could do at the Combine, but ran a 40 in a pro day maybe 2-3 weeks before the draft. So you have to think about what injuries someone has, how to treat them, and whether you're going to have surgery now, whether you're going to wait, because if it's a significant enough injury where the player wouldn't be able to work out, how that's going to affect somebody's draft position. One thing that a lot of players will expect you to do, which may not have much of a bearing on their draft position, is creation of a highlight tape. That may be more of a vanity thing for the player, in all honesty, but that's one thing that you're expected to do. And when you're representing a player during the whole draft process, you're going to be contacting people at the teams, whether it's GM, college scouting director. One thing you want to do is try to get the team's assessments of their strengths and weaknesses. One, with the weaknesses, you can get an idea of what the player needs to work on. And 2, you can try to correct any misperceptions that the team may have of your players. And also, you're going to use the media to some degree, whether it makes a difference or not. But sometimes, like, an owner may see something about a player in the media, because one thing we did maybe about 10 years ago was we represented Kerry Colbert out of USC. He was a 2nd round pick. Mike Williams was their marquee receiver. Kerry had been given a label as a possession guy. So one thing we started doing was floating to certain media contacts, was looking at the number of big plays Kerry had versus Mike Williams, yards per catch and things like that. And it turned out Kerry actually had more big plays than Mike Williams, trying to dispel the myth that he's a possession receiver. And I don't know whether those things have any bearing on decisions from a draft standpoint, but at the same time, if it can help change the perception a little bit, I think it's worth doing stuff like that. Once you have a rookie client, particularly one that isn't highly marketable, and all players think they're more marketable than they actually are. They all think that even your offensive lineman thinks there's some deal that he can get. You're going to have to look at what deals you can and can't get for guys. You can market a guy who's not highly desirable from a marketing standpoint, at least locally or in his home city and in his NFL city. And some things we did for some of these lower level guys is first try to lay a foundation through PR to try to raise their profile in their community. And 2, you can do some things like trade outs. You have to be a little creative. We had one guy who had a court furniture trade out, because when you go to a city as a rookie, there are things you're not thinking about. I need furniture. Am I going to rent or am I going to buy? This guy played for a team for like 7 years, never bought in the city because he knew he didn't want to live there, but had a furniture deal where he either did appearances or gave them tickets to select games. So that's not your conventional endorsement deal, but at the same time, it brings some value to the player. We've done that before with cars, because one thing you used to see that was really prevalent was you could get car deals in an NFL city for players where they may do an appearance at the dealership or maybe do a print ad or something, and he'd get use of a car for the season or for the whole year. As players started abusing the cars, that became reserved more for a star player or superstar player. But what I found out is if you're looking at a rental car agency, you may be able to do a ticket trade out for the player where he gets a rental car that he turns in every month that gets a different car, and for the year he's got use of a car. Maybe it's a second car for like when family comes up there, if he's not a guy who's already bought a new car. But those are some of the things you can do from a marketing endorsement standpoint for guys who aren't the highest visibility guys or guys that are considered to be at the higher end of marketability.
Joel,
yes.
You had mentioned selling the client, basically, or potential client, on something that you could provide that other agencies can't provide. What would be examples of that?
Well, one thing, if you don't have a lot of clients, that you're going to sell more than anything else is personal attention. Because you'll have some clients that may be attracted to a big name or a marquee agent that are maybe mid-round picks, late-round picks. That may not be the right agency for them, because what could happen is they're not going to get the attention of the main agent. They're probably going to be pawned off on a lower level guy, maybe someone who is less experienced. And if they're a guy that's not going to make them a lot of money, then are they really going to treat him the same way they would treat a Peyton Manning? So that can play into your benefit, which is the whole personal aspect of representation, because it is a personal service relationship if it's done properly. There's some agencies that their business model is, if I sign 10 players, I lose 4, I'm up 6, I overpromise and underdeliver in the service aspect. So that's one area where you can kind of try to distinguish yourself from a personal service aspect.
And Joe, let me add something. My favorite story, Matt Moore just turned 30 today, been in the league 9 years, and when Brody speaks, we'll talk about what we do with a player that becomes a veteran. But one thing that I do, and I'll tell you that because we have our agent advisor, we have the website, we have a turnkey approach once you graduate. But when Matt Moore came to our office through a relationship with the agent advisor, I said, you're not going to get drafted. And his dad wasn't very happy with me. But like Joe, I don't want to be involved with somebody. You tell them they're going to get drafted. You think it's no fun. It's a virtual green room in everybody's house. There's not a kid in the draft in the NFL that doesn't think he's going to be drafted. Even if he's not going to be drafted, and nobody thinks he's going to be, he still thinks he's going to be drafted. And so does the family. And so we take a lot of pride and rather be blunt and lose the player with honesty than to play. It's a sad story. And then you don't get called. It's even sadder, because you've been successful all your life. So I like what you said, and I just want you to know that philosophically, we'll never join into the inflated assessment with the family. And if we lose the kid, because I'd rather lose them. I have kids that I quit recruiting, they went with somebody that did the $10,000 workout, never got called. Now they're coming, they call you back, say, well, can you get, no. But managing expectation, I think, is the hardest thing.
Oh, no doubt. That is one of the hardest things, because a lot of agents, or even when they have them as clients, are afraid to tell their clients what they need to hear. They'll tell them what they want to hear out of fear of losing the client. So I think going in, if you can set the tone with the relationship, that I'm always going to tell you what's in your best interest and what's truthful, and there are clients who want to hear that, then those are the types of guys you're going to want to represent.